Hi folks, welcome to this video on activating and maintaining an effective compensation system. Some of the items you see here on the screen are terms that we'll be discussing throughout the presentation. They're also listed in your text. Some of the objectives that we'll cover in this video series is identifying some of the key issues in preparing to implement a compensation system and also developing an implementation plan for the new compensation system. As part of that implementation plan, we'll discuss some of the necessary steps for implementing the system, as well as some of the key considerations for communicating the system. You'll remember in previous chapters, we've always talked about the importance of communicating to employees, how important it is that they understand the system and how it's going to impact them. So we'll get down to some of the key considerations again in this chapter. We'll also explain how to evaluate the system effectiveness, and again we'll have to compare what we expected to happen, or what is happening I should say, with the objectives that we had in mind for the system. And we'll also have to identify circumstances leading to changes in the system, as well as any considerations in adapting the compensation system once it's been implemented. So now let's focus in on the implementation, preparation, and some of the key issues. Here we've identified 4 key issues in preparing for implementation. The first one is preparing a compensation budget. We always want to make sure that if we're implementing anything new, particularly compensation, that we're working within a budget so we don't overspend. We also want to, as one of the key issues here, plan for the administration of the system, so who's doing what. We also want to determine what the role is for information technology. Presumably, there will be some information captured through the IT department, so we want to make sure that we've got plans in place to do that, and also we want to make sure that we stay organized for compensation administration. So let's begin our discussions. Traditionally, compensation budgeting has been done in one of 2 ways, either a bottom-up or top-down approach. In the bottom-up approach, the compensation rates for the coming year are applied to employees, and that requires factoring in any merit increases employees might get, as well as any seniority increases. We also have to anticipate any turnover for people that we anticipate may quit or retire. Don't forget, turnover reduces compensation costs because if we're planning on replacing any of those people who retire or terminate, we normally, not always, but we normally start new employees at a lower starting rate than those that we're paying at the time they retire or quit. In a top-down approach, management usually sets a limit on the total amount of compensation that's going to be available for the coming year. Sometimes it's based on an adjustment of last year's compensation bill. So a company might decide whatever they've spent, they want to spend 10% less, or maybe they think they can spend 10% more. But that total compensation amount it has to be determined at the beginning. And then the company will divide the available funds among the departments and the different units or regions. And then in turn, management will divide them up among employees. And sometimes if it's pay-based or performance-based, it depends on what the employee's goals and objectives were. Now, the importance of a budget is that it allows companies to control their costs, because don't forget, any departments that get a particular budget allocated to them for compensation, they can't exceed it. If they want to exceed it, then they're going to have to get special permission, and that's not always easy to get. But the idea is, if people know or departments know what their budget is, they can work within it. The budget also serves as a benchmark against which the company can evaluate whether the compensation system is behaving as expected. So the idea behind this objective, or this item for a compensation budget, would be that if we've spent the available funds and we're still not getting the productivity or the returns or whatever yardstick we were measuring the compensation system against, then obviously it must not have been money well spent. So we might need to kind of readjust or rethink how we allocated it, how we came up with it, or even the components of it, the mix of compensation might not be appropriate. So we have to think about that. Now let's talk a little bit about compensation administration and some of the things that we do during that process. First thing we would do is we need to document the compensation system. There's two aspects of documentation that are particularly important. The first is the compensation system itself. So, if job evaluation is to be used, then we need some job evaluation manuals to be prepared that provide employees with the compensable factors, the scales for measuring these compensable factors, and any procedures that we have in place for applying them to the job. If we're using pay for knowledge, for example, then we have to have some procedures documented and in place for assessing skill levels of the employees and any competencies that we want to document that employees have to have met in order to be eligible for a pay increase due to the skills they've achieved. Benefits must also be described, so the healthcare benefit package, along with any application procedures that employees might need to go through, whether it's online or on paper. Any payout limits that the plans might have might be things like deductibles, things that employees are paying, those types of things. The second item involved in documentation is assigning responsibilities for carrying out the various compensation processes and spelling out which organizational units are responsible for particular tasks. So an additional thing might be if a company, most companies are dealing with outside service providers like Sun Life or Manulife to administer the benefit claims. So in many cases, the company would negotiate and draw up contracts they have with these service providers. So it could be Sun Life, Manulife, it could be ADP or any kind of outside payroll service. These contracts need to describe the services to be provided, including any performance standards that the company wants to see in place from its service providers and any penalties in place for failure to meet them, as well as outlining what the employer is responsible to provide to these providers and within time frames. So as you can see, this can be a very complicated and involved process just to know what we need to document in the compensation system. But it is something that's important in order to make sure the system is properly documented and therefore is capable of being administered. The next thing we want to do is to collect any employee information that we need. So we need to ensure that compensation is accurate by collecting any pay-related information to ensure all required calculations for bonuses, overtime, merit pay increases, those kinds of things are accurate. We also want to make sure that when we collect all the employee information, we're collecting things on tax rates through our payroll department to know how much tax to deduct, all of these kinds of things that are very important. The compensation system or compensation administration of the system is also involving, as we said earlier, calculation of any of the remittances that go to the government. So even things like CPP or EI, not just the company portion, but the employee portions as well, also have to be calculated as part of the administration system. So we also need to know what rates of EI or amounts of EI or CPP that have to be deducted from employee checks as part of that remittance process. So we need to collect all that information based on what we're paying our employees to make sure we make proper remittances to the government. We also need to assign responsibilities for compensation administration. So who exactly is responsible for inputting employee transactions? Who's going to develop any of the forms, whether they're paper-based forms or online forms, for recording the transactions, and the computer system for performing pay calculations? Who prepares checks? Or if you're not always using checks, who makes the arrangements, or from where do we get the information or ensure we've got information on employee banking requirements so that we know where to deposit checks? Okay, so who's going to make sure we have all that? Is it the payroll department? Is it the accounting department? Is it the HR department? Or is it going to be an outside service provider, like an outside payroll service provider? All right. When it comes to communication of compensation information, employees and their managers all need to be made aware of any changes to the compensation system that affect them. And they also need to be made aware of any responsibilities they have for providing information necessary so that compensation can be administered. So salary increases need to be in by a certain date. Management needs to make sure they're in. If performance appraisals that dictate how much of an increase employees are going to get need to be done by a certain date, then there are deadlines attached to these, because any merit increases or bonuses, they're going to be paid on a particular date. So we need to make sure that we have all the information that we need from these people. So it's important that HR or payroll or all of these groups communicate to employees and management what they need in order to administer the compensation system properly. So that concludes our first video. We'll be talking a little bit about planning for information technology in our next video series on this topic.